Amy Edmondson said, high standards in a context where there is uncertainty or interdependence, or both, combined with a lack of psychological safety, comprise a recipe for suboptimal performance. The Team First Balanced Accountability Guide is intended for use by leadership teams within helping systems. It helps discern how accountable a system versus a professional may be responsible for an action or an inaction in the workplace. Especially in light of unwanted or even tragic outcomes, hindsight and outcome bias can influence leaders' next steps, and leadership teams benefit from a tool to help contextualize professional performance and decision-making. This tool resists the assumption that a professional has sole individual culpability in a given decision. Professionals generally do their best, and they engage in high-risk, interdependent work to help elevate and improve the quality of life for those in their communities. Sanctioning professionals for well-intentioned, commonplace actions or inactions can have a chilling effect on workplace culture. It can create psychological fear instead of safety, and lead to mistakes, concerns, and divergent points of view being hidden from leaders who can and want to help. These moments can have outsized impact on professionals who are watching leaders' response towards one another, towards their peers, and are considering that the next time it could be them. The Team First Balanced Accountability Guide is an exercise to explore complexity in decision-making. It fosters a supportive inquiry and systems thinking to discern a balanced and shared perspective on accountability in the workplace. Our inspiration for it came from Amy Edmondson's work on types of failure and also James Reason's culpability model. The guide won't tell you what to do, but it supports you in considering a range of contextual factors to help your next decision as a leadership team to be the best ones.
We generally think about two approaches to accountability in systems, sort of the historic retributive approach that would exist in most HR systems inside organizations, where the issue is thinking about rule breaking and blame and what happened, what thing wasn't done, what policy wasn't followed, and what's the appropriate and proportional response to that deviation. The more contemporary approach that's grounded in systems thinking is a restorative approach. And a restorative approach is really concerned with human behavior in complex systems. It assumes accountability can be accomplished through repair, prevention, learning. And so in a restorative approach, you would ask questions like, who was harmed? What do they need? Who's responsible for doing it? Thinking not about one or the other, because both have a place in systems, but definitely thinking about how do we incorporate a restorative approach when we're thinking about balancing a system and an individual accountability in a system. And so then from this perspective, accountability in a retributive culture becomes an account that somebody has to pay. And then by contrast, accountability in a restorative culture becomes an account or a story that's told how we learn and think about our system. When we're talking about this idea of balancing system and individual accountability, the idea of balance is a bit of a misnomer, but it's sometimes a useful metaphor to explain how we think about the role of people in complex systems. So it's limited as a metaphor because it's really difficult to separate a person out from the system they work within. I think Julia Kaufman's definition of a system is a really good one. It's this idea that a system is a set of interconnected, interdependent, interacting parts that form a complex whole. And it's this notion too that a system's boundaries are a useful fiction. We don't really have boundaries around our systems. We kind of put them there because they're useful for us to understand. And that's sort of what I mean when we're thinking about this idea of how do we separate the person out from the system they work within. So balance is useful for us to kind of describe the idea as a metaphor, but it's limited in that it's really difficult to actually separate a person from the system they work within. James Reason's work on accidents, accident causation, we relied heavily on in developing the guide. Reason put into the literature a Swiss cheese model that, again, I think is a really useful but limited metaphor for thinking about how accidents occur, how bad things happen, or things that we don't want to happen, critical incidents variations in practice, just how these things occur in our system. And Reason's model sort of portrays these layers of Swiss cheese that are the layers of your organization, going from down at the point of care where our professionals work, all the way up through the highest levels of our organization. And based on Reason's model, it's only when these holes in the Swiss cheese line up, when all of the barriers we put in place to keep people safe, our training, our policies, our supervision, it's when all those things sort of line up that an accident occurs and we have this bad outcome that we wanted to avoid. Of course, we know accidents are much more complex than that. They don't move in that linear fashion, but protective layers in our system, I think, is a really valuable one, and I think it makes the metaphor still useful, if not perfect. So what we hope to help people do when they're thinking about this balance is, don't stop down there at the point of care where the thing happened, where your professional's working, but push yourself to think up through all those additional layers when you're thinking about the things that might have protected the work that they're doing. So in developing this guide, we leaned on and adapted the culpability tree that was developed by James Reason. And so an important word of caution about algorithmic decision making is that they can be sort of binary, good choice, bad choice. And we want to caution against that because it tends to miss the messiness of systems. And so while we think the decision tree and algorithmic approach is helpful in sort of supporting your decisions, it shouldn't be relied on to make your decision. You start the guide by asking two really important questions. Were the actions intended? Did your staff member or the folks you're looking at their work, did they intend to do the thing they did? And then really importantly, did they intend the outcome? So it's certainly the case that someone can intend to do something, even if that's intending to do something that's a variation from policy or typical practice, but they didn't intend that bad outcome to happen. And that's an important thing for us to think about when we're thinking about accountability. And then when we get beyond that question, let's say we've said yes to one and no to the other, or maybe no to both. The next important thing for us to think about is impairment. And this is where we depart a little bit from a traditional approach that Reason might have taken, which is we expand our thinking of impairment beyond just what you might think about, which would be substance abuse or using medications that impair your functioning at work. But there are other things in the system that impair your ability to do good work, things like fatigue and burnout and stress. And so we want to include that in our definition of impairment. Was our professional, when they were making these decisions, influenced by other things in the system that created a lot of stress and affected the way they made decisions, or we were keeping them up all night and they were fatigued in the way they were making decisions? And so that's an important next step in this process, is thinking about impairment. And then the other important rule of thumb that we use when we're making these decisions is the idea of a substitution test. And the substitution test, very simply, is if a mistake happened, an error happened, there was variation in someone's practice, if you can reasonably say that 3 out of 4 people, given the same training, the same context, same time of day, same situation, would have made that same mistake, it passes the substitution test. And it's not then about individual culpability, but it's about a systems problem.